Okay, let us begin. Tonight we're going to start a new topic, which is going to be the topic of cooking on Shabbos. So you can't it's a lot to say about cooking on Shabbos, so we're probably not gonna do everything tonight, but we'll start with the you know we'll just define the different types of cooking they can have on Shabbos, and then we're going to talk also about different types of kalim. You know, if you put something into a bowl, let's say you put something into a bowl and the bowl is very hot and you have hot water in that bowl. So is that called cooking or not? So it's just mostly going to be defining terms, talking about that in tonight's year, and then hopefully over the course of the next few weeks we'll get into more of the details. There's a lot to discuss about cooking on Shabbos. So first, cooking. So bishul, cooking is bishul, right? The Hebrew word for cooking is bishul. Bishul is generally defined as causing a qualitative change in the property of an item by using heat. Meaning you got to change the actual item by heating it up to be called cooking. So some say, toast, for example. Some say that's not called cooking because, you know, you didn't change anything. You just heated up the bread. Okay, it got a little crusty, but it's not really called cooking. So to be called cooking, not everyone agrees with that. But to be called cooking, generally means you need to have a qualitative change in the actual item. The Mishnah Brewer writes that he says food, um, says uh, these like spices and water can all have cooking. It says when there's a qualitative change in the item, that is called bishul, that's called cooking. Um, it says, and cooking can be with food or items that are not just food. It doesn't just, it does the prohibition of cooking on Shabbos is not only true about food. The rule is if you harden that which is soft or soften that which is hard, that is called that is called cooking. So it's not just limited to food. And the Rambam, he writes similarly. So the Rambam writes, if you bake bread or you cook food, or if you cook these dyes, these herbs on Shabbos, or if you cook water, you're yeah, in any of these three cases, you're going to be obligated for cooking on Shabbos. So the question that many ask on the Rambam is that these different categories. Why does he write these different categories? Why is he making a big deal about it? Which is and why does he also write it in that order? So there's a lot of discussion about that. Some say maybe he's dividing it by the amount. You know, there's a shear. There's this, until you cook a certain amount, maybe you're not obligated. So maybe he's dividing it by the amount. That's how the Maggid Mishnah explains. But others explain a little bit differently. They say that when you think about it, um, these three different examples that the Rambam brings, food, dyes, and water, are not just examples, they're actually categories, different types of categories of how one can cook on Shabbos. So it says, food is about turning something which is inedible into something which is edible. When you do that, you have cooked something on Shabbos. Now, if you have something which is not food, the Gemara says in and the Gemara says in Shabbos is that if you take a peg, if you take like a wooden peg and you soften it, and then it hardens, so the Gemara says that that's called cooking. And so the Rambam understands that softening something hard and hardening something which is soft, nothing to do with food. It's not a food item. This is a wooden peg, but you're softening it. That is still called cooking. So that's another category of cooking, but it doesn't have the same rules as food. It's not about making something edible or or taste, you're able to eat it. It's about hardening or softening. And then finally there's water. Water also is a third example the Rambam brings, and perhaps also a third category, because water is edible whether before you cook it, you know, but water that's cold you can drink, and it's hot you can still drink it. And it's not about softening or hardening because water doesn't get soft or hard. It's just water. So what does it mean to cook water? So it would seem that for water, that it's different. And cooking water seems to be just heating it up to a point to yad soletispo, which is going to be which is important measurement, but it's literally the point where your hand would touch back, because when you heat water up to that point, it becomes the nature of water actually changes, and there's proofs to that throughout the Gemaras. The Gemara says that in Chulin says that you can't wash your hands for Netilas Yadayim when you have water that's yad soletispo, when water gets to a certain heat temperature. And Rashi explains there when water gets heat to that temperature, it no longer has the status of regular water because it's different in nature than typical water. It works differently, and so it has different status. So the point being, though, is that we think about cooking, and we think about cooking on Shabbos, and we think of that in terms of food, only food. But it's important to understand that it's not just food that you can cook on Shabbos. It's also non-food items. If you soften them or you harden it, some people say that this is the issue with a blech, that or if you put like a certain piece of metal, maybe you're cooking metal, and then if you're softening metal, then that might be cooking on Shabbos. So it's important to understand that might be cooking, and then also water too. That it's not about making water edible; it's about heating it up to a certain temperature, and if it heats up to a certain temperature, that is called cooking on Shabbos. Okay, so that's part one. Next thing to discuss tonight is to just define these certain kalim, to define certain levels of cooking, and to discuss what is biblical cooking, what is non-biblical cooking. So the Gemara, we'll start with the Gemara. The Gemara tells the following story. It says Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi, he was walking with Rabbi into a bathhouse. So they were walking together. And so he asked Rabbi, he said, I want to heat up a jug of oil by putting it into this bathtub of the springs of Tiberia. Springs of Tiberia were hot. So he says, he basically said, I want to heat up this jug of oil. What can I do? So Rabbi says, I'll tell you what to do. You can put these springs, these hot springs, into a kli sheni. We're going to define what that means in a second. You can put this hot water into a kli sheni, and then put the oil in to the kli sheni, and then in that way your oil will get hot. So the Gemara says we see a few things from this Gemara. We see number one, that you can cook oil. Oil can be cooked. Number two, that heat to cook the oil doesn't need to be so hot. And then the Gemara says this third line, which is very important for us tonight, which is that kli sheni, in a kli sheni, it's eno mevashel. It does not cook. Okay, so what's a kli rishon? What's a kli sheni? So a kli rishon, to define the term, means you have a pot or a vessel of any sort that was on the fire. That's what a kli rishon means. That this thing was on the fire. So you say you put your pot on the stove, right, and you turn the heat and you turn the fire on. So now that pot is called a kli rishon. Now what if you take that pot off the fire? So now that becomes a little bit different in status. It becomes a kli rishon shelo al gabe eish, meaning it's not on the fire anymore. And so we're going to about to discuss, is there a difference between a pot which is on the fire, halachic difference? Is there a difference between the pot that's on the fire versus the same pot, right, which was once on the fire but is now no longer on the fire? Are they different halachically? That's a kli rishon, and kli rishon shelo al gabe eish. And then let's say you take that pot, and pour it. You take that pot and pour it into a new pot. So now there's two more new terms. So the first one is what is the status? What is the status of when you pour it into a new pot. So that's called something called Eroi, means pouring. So when you pour that first pot into the second pot, that's called an Eroi, a pouring from the first pot to the second pot. And let's say you would have say you would have something that would be pour. Let's say you would take that water and pour it over something, and by doing that, it would cook the item. So that would that's Eroi Clearishon. So is that called cooking or not? And then finally, when that water is in the second pot, you move the water from the first pot, you poured it into the second pot, and now let's say you put something into that second pot. Now that second pot was never on the fire, so that's called a kli sheni. That is a second pot, right? So that's it. How do we define that halachically? Okay, so we're going to get through all of them, but we just needed to define the terms there a little bit. So the Gemara in Yerushalmi says the following statement. It says that with a kli rishon, when you have a when you have a when you have a kli rishon, right, you have this first kli, which was on the fire. So the Gemara says we are stringent to make a harchaka, like we want to be very careful. But with kli sheni, there's no need to be very careful. So it seems from here that if you were to cook into it, meaning it's obvious. Let's start with what's obvious and then what's less obvious. If you're going to cook in a pot, if you have a pot that's on the fire and you're going to put food into that pot, so that's pretty obvious. That's cooking. That's cooking deraisa biblically, and there's nobody that argues on that. You put something into a pot that's on the fire and you cook it, that is usher deraisa. You have done cooking on Shabbos. Now let's say you take that pot off the fire, and the contents of that pot are still hot. It's above the temperature of Yatz Lettucebo, which is I think they say somewhere between like 115 degrees to 160 degrees. So it's hot. It has hot water in there. And then you put something into the water there, and it's no longer on the fire. You took it off the fire. It's still hot, and now um, so you threw something into the fire. So is that called cooking or not? So the Gemara seems to imply it's cooking, but the Gemara seems to imply that it's not cooking on a biblical level, it's cooking on a rabbinical level. And this is a big discussion. There are many proofs, many different ways. And Gemara's many ways to prove both ways. But it seems that at the end of the day, after all the proofs, it seems that the way we paskin is that in order to have a biblical cooking, it needs to actually be on the fire. So if you would take this pot and take it off the fire, turn into kli rishon shelo al gabe, which is not on the fire, so that's only going to be cooking on a rabbinical level. Okay, so that's the first thing. That's the first thing to know. Now, what happened? What about a kli sheni, right? We quoted the Gemara that said that for a kli rishon, right, when it's a first vessel, which is off the fire, so the Gemara says we're going to be stringent, but when it's in a kli sheni, when it's in that second pot, so now we're not going to be as stringent. So the Gemara seems to be saying that, and the Gemara says why? Because a kli sheni does not cook. A kli sheni it does not cook at all. It's eino mivashal. So that is indeed how we paskin as well. That's what we hold according to halacha. I mean, there are some exceptions which we'll get to, but the question which everyone wonders is why. Meaning, let's say I do that. Let's say I boil up water and I pour that into a second pot. Now that the second pot was never on the fire, but the water inside that pot is very hot. I could for sure cook in it. It's physically hot. So how could we say that that's not called cooking? So this is where there's a famous concept of Tosfos that Tosfos says, how he asks this question, how could it be that you could say that in a second kli sheni it doesn't cook? It says if it's yad zoladispo, if it's hot, it's for sure hot enough to cook. What are you talking about? Of course I could cook in that pot. So he says the following, he says, since a kli rishon that was on the fire has dofnos chamim. It has walls that are hot. So therefore, it was able to cook as long as it was yad lettuce, but as long as the contents of that pot were hot. In a kli rishon, which was once on the fire, its walls were hot, so it could cook. But in a kli sheni, the walls were never hot, and it's constantly holech umiskarer, meaning the walls of the pot are going to cool off the contents of that pot, meaning the water that you poured inside that. And therefore, if you would now put any food, say you put meat into that water, right, it wouldn't be cooking because it's in a klisheni, and the walls of that pot are cooling down the contents of the pot. Therefore, it is not cooking. So some explain more. The Tosfos, they explain further. They say explain when there is a pot that does not have walls that are hot, so it's similar to cooking in a very weird manner. Um, so that's not called cooking. And that would also explain that why there are some exceptions. That if you have some items, which we'll get to, kale abishal, you have items which are very easy to cook. So then it's maybe not so strange to cook something that gets cooked so easily, even if the walls of the pot are not hot. But that is the primary explanation of why a klisheni, a second vessel, why it would not cook. Besides for the exceptions, there's another explanation of the Or Sameach. He provides another explanation. He says that he basically says it's a tolda de tolda, and it gets too far removed. And therefore, when you have a kli sheni, it's a tolda, it's too far removed, meaning a kli rishon met a fire, right? A kli rishon saw a fire once. It's not on the fire anymore when shelo agal be'esh, and we still say it will cook, albeit rabbinically. But a kli sheni never even met a fire. So if it never even met a fire, then we're not going to say it cooks, even on a rabbinical level. Yeah. So that's klisheni. And then finally, this will be our last topic for tonight. What is the status when you do Eroi Kli Rishon? You take water from your kettle, right? Your kettle was on the fire, you boiled it up, and now you pour it over something that is raw. So does that water have the capacity to cook something? That is Eroi Kli Rishon. You're taking water from the kettle that was hot and you're pouring it over something raw. So again, physically, you might think that it could cook something, but we want to know halachically. Halachically, is that called cooking or not? So this is a big machlokes among the Rishonim. It's a three-way, but really four-way machlokes. Do we say this cooks or not? So the opinion of the Rashbam, and the opinion of Rabbeinu Yonah, but for different reasons, they understand that to do this pouring, Irei Kli Rishon, is not called cooking at all. Because it's not cooking. It's totally like a klisheni. There is no cooking, and it's fine. Rabbeinu Tam says it is cooking, but just a little bit. It cooks basically just the outer layer, right? But it doesn't cook the entire thing. And then the opinion of the Re, he says, is that it completely cooks it. So where do they get these opinions from? Where do these opinions come from? So the Gemara in Shabbos says that you can't put so you can't take tavla, and you can't put spices and put it into a kli rishon to cook it. That's what the Gemara says. So the Rashbam says, sounds like doing anything else. Meaning you can't put into kli rishon to cook it, but it sounds like what would be permitted is to take kli rishon and pour it over something else, because it just said you just can't put food into a kli rishon. Didn't say you can't pour anything over. You can't pour from a kli rishon into anything else to cook. But Rabbeinu Tam is not convinced. He doesn't think that's a good proof. Because he says the Mishnah continues and says, but you can put it into a Kli Sheni. So Rabbeinu Tam says, if Rashbam, if you were right that everything else was permitted, including pouring, then why wouldn't the Mishnah say that? Why does the Mishnah have to say, what is permitted is to put it into a Kli Sheni? There's this in between category, right? This happens sometimes in the Mishnah when the Mishnah says the Mishnah will say one thing is asur, the next thing is mutter, but there's something in between. So what's the status of this thing in between? So that's exactly what the Rashbam and Rabbeinu Tam are arguing about. Rashbam is saying you learn from the first thing that's asur, right? So everything else is that's the barometer from the top. So you go from there. And Rabbeinu Tam is learning from the other way. So that's one source that they argue about. The other source, which is the baseline, the basis for many of the opinions of the Rishonim is from the following Gemara in Pesachim. The Gemara says it's a very interesting concept. The Gemara says, let's say you have two cold things that touch each other. Let's say you have one thing which is you have a kosher piece of meat, and then someone accidentally had a kosher, a non-kosher piece of meat. They had a piece of pig, right? And the pig touched your steak. Oh no. But they were both cold. So what happens? Can you still eat your steak? Or are you done? So the Gemara says if they're both cold and they touch each other, there's no heat involved, so don't worry. Even though you might be scared, right? You probably don't want to go anywhere near a pig. The Gemara says that's totally fine. Just rinse it off, no problem. Eat your steak. You're all okay. Okay. The Gemara says, what happens if they were both hot, right? You had your hot piece of steak and this hot piece of pig, bacon, whatever it was, and it touches your piece of steak. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, then you have to for sure throw it out because there are going to be blios, right? There's going to be food taste that's absorbed from the pig into your piece of meat, right? Your kosher steak, and it's going to make your steak not kosher. So the Gemara says that's no good. So the Gemara says, what if one of them? So I know the rule of what if both of them are cold. If both of them are cold, I rinse it off, no problem. I can eat it. I know the rule if both of them are hot. I had to throw it out. I can't eat this anymore. What if one of them is cold, one of them is hot? So do the blios, right? Does the taste of the pig transfer over to the steak in that case? So Gemara says this is a machlokas between Rav and Shmuel. Shmuel says tisa gavar, which means we go by whichever one is on the bottom. Meaning, let's say you're we're going to stick with the same example for both cases. The steak's on the bottom and the pig falls onto the piece of steak. So let's say the steak is hot. But if the steak is hot, so Shmuel says you go by the thing that is on the bottom. The steak was on the bottom, and therefore, right, the taste is going to transfer. But let's say the steak was cold and it's still on the bottom, right? So then it's going to be as if it's cold and it's not going to transfer. That's called tisa gavar. That's the opinion of Shmuel. The opinion of Rav is that he says you go by the thing on the top, right? Whatever is on the top decides if there's taste that transfers or not. Raining, so that means you go by what if the status of the pig in that example, right? If the pig was hot, then since the pig fell on top of the steak, it would transfer. But if the pig is cold, right, even if the steak is hot, it would not transfer. So that's the machlokas between Rav and Shmuel. So how do we paskin? So usually the rule is whenever we have a machlokas between Rav and Shmuel, the rule is that if we're talking about Mammon, we're talking about things that relate to money. So usually we follow Shmuel, and if we have something that relates to Isser v'Heter, meaning something status, if something is permitted or not permitted, but not related to money, so usually we paskin in that case like Rav. So this is Isser v'Heter, but we paskin like Shmuel here. So this one is one of the cases that does not follow the rule, and we paskin like Shmuel, which means that we go by whatever's on the bottom. So why are we saying all this? How does this relate to Roey? So the Rashbam says, okay, let me I can understand and rule from here that every case of Iroi, it's very similar to Tisa Gavar, right? We have this rule. So we know Tisa Gavar, we know the rule is right when you have this right steak on top of the meat, we go by the bottom. So it says every case of Iroi, when I pour something hot into something raw, right? We know the rule. We paskin like Shmuel. We paskin, we go by the bottom. So the bottom is cold. So that means we're going to say it doesn't cook, right? We follow the status of the thing that's on the bottom, says the Rashbam. We learned the halacha here from this Gemara in Pesachim. So therefore, every case of pouring, there is no cooking. We follow the thing on the bottom. So he says, Iroi must be Ein Mavashal doesn't cook. That's the opinion of the Rashbam. Rabbeinu Tam, he argues on this. He says, that's very nice, Rashbam. I agree with you that this is very similar to sagavar, right? This case, like a steak that falls on meat. But the problem is you forgot one aspect of the halacha there. The halacha is that in Tisa Gavar, even though we say that the bottom doesn't cook, right? We say if the bottom is cold, it doesn't cook, but we still say that it cooks a kidei klipa, meaning the top of it does cook. So he says this is actually a proof for me. You tried the Rashbam, you tried to bring this as a proof for you, but it's a proof for me, says Rabbeinu Tam, because it cooks a little bit. So it seems like a good point from Rabbeinu Tam. But the Shach explains that no, the Rashbam might say that you know, for that to transfer over taste does not exactly follow the same exact rules as cooking. Maybe to accomplish transfer of taste, blios, there's less heat required, but for cooking, there'd be more heat required, so it would totally not be cooking at all. Okay, but then you see both the Rashbam and Rabbeinu Tam have get their opinions from this Gemara. The Re gets his opinion. So he says that it cooks completely. The question is, what does he do with his Gemara? So the Re he explained that this Gemara was talking about. He has this concept, which is that there's a difference between a stream, which breaks, and a stream which does not break. So he says our Gemara here in Pesachim, which we're talking about, Tisa Gavar, is talking about a stream which broke. It's shenifsak hakiluach. It was indirect. So there we're not going to say it cooks. But if you have a stream, right, that did not break at all, it went straight onto the raw item, so that's for sure cooking. So he basically says that this Gemara is not talking about the same thing. And then the opinion of the Ran, he says similar to the Rashbam that doesn't cook at all, but he says it for a different reason. He says the moment it leaves the Kli Rishon, right? The moment you start pouring out of that first pot, it loses the ability to be cooked, and it has the status of a Kli Sheni at that point. It has nothing to do that when it hits the item, right? The Rashbam understands that when it hits the bottom item is cold, and that's going to make the water that you poured on top of it cold too. The Rabbeinu Yonah understands that it's not because of that. It's because as soon as you started pouring, then it's going to be cold as well. So the question is, okay, so now we know we have these four opinions among the Rishonim. How do we paskin? What do we say the halacha is? So Shulchan Aruch writes, he says very vaguely, he says it's prohibited to put this tavlin on a plate and pour over it with a Iroi Kli Rishon. He just says you can't do it. So which one is he passing like? It's not clear, right? It could be he's passing like Rabbeinu Tam, that it cooks a Kidei Klipa, cooks a little bit. It could be he's passing like the Re, that it's totally cooking. Or it could be he's passing like the Rashbam, and he just thinks it's a good idea to be stringent. So Mishnah Brura, he thinks that that the Shulchan Aruch is passing like the Rabbeinu Tam. That seems to be the opinion of most people, is that Shulchan Aruch is passing like the Rabbeinu Tam, which would mean that if you do an Iroi, if you pour from a Kli Rishon onto raw item, it cooks a little bit, it cooks a Kidei Klipa. Very interestingly, and we'll close on this, the Ramah adds that when you pour water from a kettle, though, if it's nifsak hakiluach, if the stream breaks, then it's like a Kli Sheni, right? And doesn't cook at all. But if it is low nifsak hakiluach, then it's like a Kidei Klipa. So it's interesting is that the Ramah, he's quoting this same same idea that the Re quoted to explain his opinion why it cooks completely, but he's not passing like the Re, he's passing with the Rabbeinu Tam. So the Vilna Gaon explains that even though we're not passing like the Re, he says that it's a conceptually valid understanding that to make that there's a difference between when something pours directly versus when there's a break in the stream. So when there's a break in the stream, right, that's going to be different. So just to summarize, a cooking, you could do cooking on different items, or you could do cooking on food, you could do cooking on water, you could do cooking on non-food items, and they have different rules. And then cooking in a kli rishon, which is on the fire, that's bishul deoraisa. There's cooking on a kli rishon, which is not on a fire, and that's bishul derabanan. In a kli sheni, that's not called cooking at all, albeit there are exceptions. And then there's Roey, which is pouring from a kli rishon, which is a machlokes among the Rishonim, but we paskin that it is cooking a kidei klipa, unless when you pour the stream broke, which and then in that case it's not called cooking at all. Okay, we'll stop there.